I'd like to introduce Dr. John Medina. He is a developmental molecular biologist, a research consultant, and after sitting in on his class, I can add that he's an amazing teacher. He's also written several books, and his latest, Brain Rules, which hopefully some of you got your hands on, is hot off the press and covers much of the material that he teaches at University of Washington and Seattle Pacific University. His message is highly applicable to Google, and it's an honor to have him with us today. Please welcome Dr. John Medina.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I will speak until 12:50 or so and then take some questions, and then we'll have to scoot out of here very quickly, but we can go off into the back if there are other questions. I've been asked to speak a little bit about how the brain works. My book, Brain Rules, began as kind of a thought experiment about how the brain works. I wondered, what would it look like if you could re-engineer a learning environment like a classroom or a business to take into account a more full understanding, to take into account our more modern understanding of how the brain actually processes information? I'm a developmental molecular biologist by training, so I've spent a long time trying to figure out how brains get developed in the womb at the level of the gene, DNA, and then what happens when things screw up and you get a psychiatric disorder. So I spend a long time thinking about not only how brains process information atypically, but a lot of time on the controls to ask questions about what happens when brains respond normally. Well, if you were to try to take into account our more modern understanding of how the brain worked, to write this book, I immediately ran into two obstacles. Number one, we don't know all that much about how the brain works. If we ever learned how the brain knew how to pick up this bottle and take a drink of the water from it, it would represent a major achievement. Now, that hasn't stopped entire industries from forming around what I like to call neuroastrology. You may have heard of some of these mythologies. There is a left brain, right brain personality. You only use 10% of your brain. There is the Mozart effect. There's so much conceptual confusion that we often will use the same terms but not have the same meanings. Sort of reminds me of, I don't know if any of you use Electrolux vacuum cleaners here. It is a privately held Finnish company, and it really shows how you can use the same words and have completely different definitions because of cultural biases. Here it is. They came up with a marketing slogan. They're a privately held Finnish company that had plenty of people that spoke English, but nobody who was American on staff. And they came up with a marketing slogan to try and penetrate into the North American market with their vacuum cleaners, particularly that they had to pull after 96 hours. Here it is, and it shows the definitional confusion. Here's their marketing slogan. If it sucks, it must be an Electrolux. So, the second obstacle about writing a book like this comes from the little that we do know. The brain turns out to be an extraordinarily mysterious, complex place when you try and ask it how it processes information. I start the book by asking readers to multiply the number 8,388,628 in their heads times 2 in about 5 seconds. Most of you probably can't do that, even though you might be very math competent, probably can't do that in 5 seconds. There is a young man who can accurately double that number 24 times in 38 seconds. There is a boy who can tell you the precise time of day, whether it's in the daytime or at the nighttime, and you can even query him in his sleep and he will come up with the exact number of what time it is. There's a girl who can correctly assess the dimensions of an object 20 feet away, and she's never more off than more than by about a quarter inch or so. Yet none of these kids can be taught to tie their shoes. And indeed, they have an IQ approaching about 50. So if I've got these two obstacles, what am I going to do for this book? The brain science community is certainly not clueless about how the brain works, and it is on the basis of that that I decided that I would write. We know, for example, about the brain's evolutionary performance envelope. The brain appears to have been designed to solve problems related to surviving in an unstable outdoor environment, and to do so in near constant motion. I'll say that again. The brain appears to have been designed to solve problems related to surviving in an unstable outdoor environment, and to do so in near constant motion. So it hit me. If you wanted to design a learning environment that was directly opposed to what the brain was really good at doing, you would design something, and you were interested in education, you would design something like a modern classroom. If you were interested in designing a learning environment in a business setting that was directly opposed to what the brain was good at doing, you would design something like a cubicle. And if you were interested in re-engineering learning environments to take advantage of our more modern understanding of how the brain actually processes information, whatever that is, the first horse out of the dock is you're going to have to tear down a few things and you're going to have to start over. And in starting over, that's what Brain Rules, the book I wrote, is all about. There are 12 things we know about how the brain processes information. I speak several dialects of brain science as mostly a private consultant to the biotech and pharmaceutical industry on the genetics of psychiatric disorders. I believe there are 12 things that make robust research foci. If good brain scientists and good education scientists and good business professionals ever got together and did real research experiments together, you probably someday could become prescriptive, and it would be on the back of the cognitive neurosciences. So I want to talk about, I can't do all 12 rules. I'm not even sure we're going to get to 3, but I'm going to try. The 3 brain rules we're going to talk about this afternoon are exercise, stress, and multitasking. If I don't get to all of those, that's fine. We can pick it up in the question and answers, but I will, as I've told everybody, I will quit exactly at 12:50, take a few questions, and then we can continue the discussion. So let's get into the first one. Exercise. This is the rule. This is what we know. It's rule number 1 of the book. Exercise boosts brain power. Now, I'm going to tell you specifically that exercise specifically affects brain function. It isn't just this giant, nice rising tide where everything gets healthier. There's actually some specific things it does. But I want to tell you, I don't come at this naturally. If I had my druthers, I would IV a Big Mac if I could, and I would never do any exercise. And in fact, a friend of mine once emailed me something that he entitled the email, "Hey John," he's a colleague over at Dartmouth, "Hey John, to a fat carnivore." And it's a series of questions and answers, and here it is, because that's kind of what I am. Question: I've heard that cardiovascular exercise can prolong life. Is this true? Answer: your heart is only good for so many beats, and that's it. Don't waste them on exercise. Everything wears out eventually. Speeding up your heart will not make you live longer. That's like saying you can extend the life of your car by driving it faster. Want to live longer? Take a nap. Question: how can I calculate my body-fat ratio? Answer: well, if you have a body and you have fat, your ratio is 1 to 1. If you have 2 bodies, your ratio is 2 to 1. Question: will sit-ups help prevent me from getting a little soft around the middle? Answer: definitely not. When you exercise a muscle, it gets bigger. You should only be doing sit-ups if you want a bigger stomach. And finally, question: should I cut down on meat and eat more fruits and vegetables? Answer: you must grasp logistical efficiencies. What does a cow eat? Hay and corn. And what are these? Vegetables. So a steak is nothing more than an efficient mechanism of delivering vegetables to your system. He said I would really like that, and he is absolutely right. The question is, though, what is it about exercise that really makes cognition change? Because you can actually show, and I will try to make the case here, that there's a brain-specific effect to a very particular type of exercise. It's not true for your entire body, and it's not true for all the types of cognitive gadgets you have in your head, but we can talk about specifically one of those. It actually comes on the back of aging research, interestingly enough, and I will try to talk about this tale as a tale of answering 7 questions. Coming on the back of aging research, way back when in the 1970s, 1980s, it began to be noticed as boomers began to really understand that they weren't going to live forever, that they were going to age, that there was going to be 2 types of aging. And in fact, you can show that statistically. There are 2, aging is experienced in this country and around the world as a polar, bipolar, if you will, phenomenon. There are people that age like, Mike Wallace. Have you ever seen Mike Wallace? Do you guys know how old Mike Wallace is? He's going to be 90 this May. Guy's amazing. It still would be scary to be with him in a room if you've done something wrong. His mind is bright, he's alert, he's sharp, he's got a lot going on. He's aging like I think everybody in this room would eventually like to age. But then there's a whole other, and that's whole one cohort of people that are aging like that. There's a whole other cohort on the other side that are aging more like Keith Richards. If you've ever seen Keith Richards, for those of you who don't know Keith Richards, he's a guitarist for the Rolling Stones, right? In fact, he had a head injury this summer, and nobody could tell the difference. He looks like he is aging, and he is almost 18 years, maybe 20 years younger than Mike Wallace. But he's not going through the aging process very well at all. given that there are some pharmacological experiences that he's probably experienced that Mike has not. Still controlling for it, you can show that as a cohort in the general population. There's a whole lot of people that are not going through the aging process very well at all. And by the time they get into their 70s, they're going to be dead very soon because their bodies are beginning to break down. And the question was asked was, what's up with that? How come there are these polar phenomena? Could you find an independent variable that could predict whether someone was going to transit through the aging process like Mike Wallace or was going to transit through the aging process like Keith Richards? And the answer turns out to be yes. You can see it in the name of this slide. There is an independent variable. The independent variable was presence or absence of a sedentary lifestyle. The necessary and sufficient conditions to statistically predict where you're going to be. For those of you who are into this, and I know this is being filmed, I'll give you the references right up so you don't have to go look it up for yourself. There are several famous papers here that actually put this together. Probably the most famous of these is the Clarkson-Smith paper that began to put it on the map that, in fact, the independent variable, and it's our first question, was there an independent variable that predicted the transit? The answer was yes. Presence or absence of a sedentary lifestyle. Question number 2 is related to that because once that was established, that research started to hit off. Question was asked was, Mike Wallace does seem smarter than Keith Richards. Is he? The answer is, yes, he is. Virtually every way you can measure it. Take a look at the cognitive effects of exercise, particularly. We're going to have something called executive function, which is related to problem solving, memory panel variable, which would be both long-term and short-term memory, spatial abilities, and then finally reaction time with mean reaction groups. Here is a sedentary group. If you are sedentary and have a sedentary lifestyle, we're going to look at effect sizes so that you can actually see the distance between these graphs as being the most important part. That's what you look like if you're sedentary. That's what you look like if you're exercising. It is extraordinary to ask the question, they seemed smarter. Were they? The answer was, yes, they were, and yes, they are. So began the research did to drill down, to ask the question, could you turn Keith Richards into Mike Wallace? And the answer is, well, it depends on the experiment. So let's look at the experimental design so that you can see it, and then we can answer the question. You already know, if you know what an effect size is, that we're actually looking at the distance between those two. You already know that the answer is yes, but let's unpack it. Here you go. You're going to have generalized cognitive performance. This is going to be whatever cognitive scale you're looking at to assess intelligence. Controls experimentals. You're going to have an exercise intervention of varying lengths of time, and then you're going to do a post-test, whereby you look at the cognitive performance as a reassessed model. That's generally. And what was begun to be found is, could you turn Keith Richards into Mike Wallace? Yes, you could, depending upon what you did. For example, it is now known that aerobic fitness and aerobic exercise is the necessary and sufficient type of exercise to improve cognition, and that other types of exercise, like toning exercises, don't do it, and not all cognition is affected. Let's take a look at aerobic exercise and executive function. For those of you who don't know what executive function is the same kind of thing if you're a Boeing engineer that allows you to put a satellite up into the air, so you have a lot of math and problem solving and the things that come normally with good, interesting questions. Yet it's also involved in emotional regulation. It's the same executive function ability that the Boeing engineer uses to not punch his boss in the nose if he gets a bad performance review. So you have both emotion regulation and math into one idea, executive function. Okay, let's look at aerobic fitness. Controls experimentals, and you're going to have an intervention here of about 4 months in this particular case. So you get somebody fit, and then you keep them exercising for about a 4-month period after they've become fit, and this is done with a physician. Look at that. You get the same numbers as you get with the effect sizes that we were showing you previously. So in fact, executive function increases a whopping fold in terms of your ability to move simply by doing aerobic exercise. Interestingly enough, you do not get that if all you do is toning. If all you're doing is sitting there lifting weights, it's not going to do you a darn bit of good. Here's the toning exercises at all, and it's the exact same experiment. You have the controls and the experimentals here, and executive function is not changing at all in relationship to toning, so it's not lifting weights per se. Interestingly enough, not all cognition is affected by exercise. If you ask somebody, how is your memory, and can your memory improve if you do aerobic exercise or if you do toning, the answer is, doesn't do squat. You lose 30,000 neurons a day, you're a hopeless case. Your memory's going. Here you go. Can't exercise it away. Here it is. Controls experimentals, controls experimentals. It's the pre and the post, same design we were talking about before. The yellow is going to be the aerobic exercise. The purplish flesh color is going to be the toning. You're going to do the same intervention at 4 months. And can you get it to go? The answer is nope, you're not going to change a darn thing. So it's an uneven result. But aerobic exercise affects executive function is something you can show in spades. Next question that was asked, because this was on the minds of baby boomers, is question number 4. Could it affect brain pathologies that are often directly related to cognition, like executive function and maybe even memory? So lifetime risk for Alzheimer's disease, lifetime risk for general dementia, risk of affective disorders in this particular case. For those of you who know the DSM-4A, I'm talking F33.1, major depression. It's the type of depression you usually commit suicide over, so it's a big deal, okay? Sedentary lifestyle versus active lifestyle, lifetime risks associated with it. High risk, low risk. If you have an active lifestyle, you have a 50% reduction of your risk of Alzheimer's. Done in a longitudinal over a 20-year period, or 30, doesn't matter, you get the same thing. General dementia is 60%, and a risk of affective disorders can be brought significantly lower with aerobic exercise. There's your references, particularly about depression. In fact, there's a study that's going on now. Watch for it in May, it'll come out. I think it's come out. It's been shot through a peer review, whereby they have actually done exercise and replaced psychotherapy and just kept the antidepressant medication and got the exact same treatment success with just the exercise. So is it affecting the pathologies? It appears to. It appears to be affecting the brain chemistries particularly. So the next question you can ask is, and it may be on your mind, how much exercise do you need to do in order to get these quantitative benefits? The answer is extraordinary, because the answer is not much. In our evolutionary history, it is thought we moved anywhere between 12 and 20 kilometers a day. So when we were looking at your exercise profiles per se, I am never looking at, if I was to look at how our evolutionary history was, I would have to start studying what would be marathon runners or decathletes, because that's more our evolutionary history. What I'm looking at right now with a bunch of people in cubicles is I'm looking at the captive prison state, as opposed to the realistic evolutionary state. But per se, that said, the body so wants to get off its butt and move that the instant you even tip your hat towards it, 2 or 3 times a week for 20 minutes per is all you need to get the brain up and running. Oh, for God's sake. Standard Cooperian workouts, a warm-up, you got 20 minutes at 80% maximum. Boom, do that 3 times a week, you're done. You start to get the cognitive differences. So you don't need to do very much in order to start tilting towards it. In fact, there has been a study that's called the NEAT test, non-exercise active thermogenesis. Isn't that lovely? It's our fancy term for fidgeting. They measured fidgeters versus non-fidgeters and were able to show great differences. At least if you're fidgeting, you tend to be smarter. Okay, maybe you're just more bored. Next question. How young do you need to be in order to see the benefit? Because it's done with old people, at least originally. The data, the mathematics are still strongest with older populations, but it's begun to percolate. How about middle age? How about 27-year-old ex-boxers who eat nachos for a living and wouldn't know how to actually work on a treadmill if they tried? What if you did this dirty experiment, which I'm about to show you, and there's the reference for it, whereby you take a bunch of nacho-munching 27-year-old ex-boxers who are sedentary, and you work them out and get them in shape, and you measure their executive function, and you allow them to fly high. You'll see the exact same numbers in just a second, and then you do the dirty trick. Now pull off the exercise. Stop the exercise. Let them drift back down to their nasty habits, and then see what happens to their executive function. What do you think happens? I'm glad you asked. Here it is from the Tokyo Medical and Dental School and others et al. Change in performance for executive function here, exercise duration in weeks. Here's the controls. Up it goes. Yep, they're going to get the same benefit everybody else does. Here's your experimentals where we're going to do that, but now we're going to stop the exercise, and within a 6-day period, boom, you can turn this on and off like a light switch. And reduce healthcare costs at the same time. Why does that work? I told you that it was brain specific. It isn't just that. exercise makes your heart better, and so everything else rises. The data are very clear now in two directions. I'll just tell you one, and then I'll show you the other. There's a chemical in your brain. If I say the word anterior horns of the hippocampus, has anybody ever heard of a hippocampus before, right? Okay. It's a thing that converts short-term to long-term memory. It's deeply involved in learning processes. How many of you ever heard of Bdnf, brain-derived neurotrophic factor? Have you ever heard of that before? A couple of you? Okay. For those of you who may not have heard of Bdnf before, you can think of it as miracle grow for the anterior horns of the hippocampus. Your brain cells love BDNF, and the more BDNF you can get, the more likely it is to function correctly, and that's exactly what aerobic exercise does. Elevates the number of BDNF molecules per unit cell within the anterior horns of the hippocampus. The other thing that's interesting about it that it does is that exercise specifically shifts blood flow. You get changes in cerebral blood volume, a bold signal if you're into fMRIs at all, that go directly to an area of the hippocampus called the dentate gyrus. And the dentate gyrus is the first real collisive point. It's the first point where all of the various memory systems that are going for the memory trace actually come together in one area of the brain. It's a hot area. You need a ton of blood because you got to have a lot of hazmat teams to pull off the excess electrons, and you need a lot of sugar. And what you can show is that if you do an aerobic exercise for a long period of time, you profoundly increase blood flow to that specific area of the brain. So you are getting a brain-specific effect, and that is illustrated. It looks like this. Here it is. This is the hippocampus, dentate gyrus, CA3 pyramidals, and the subiculum. If you're into it at all, you don't have to be into it. Just take a look at the executive function, BDNF, and blood flow. Subjects pre-exercise. Okay, here it is. There's your blood flow into the dentate gyrus. Now you look for BDNF levels and executive function, and they suck. Okay, you've got low BDNF levels, and you've got low executive function, and it's just going to move. Now, you exercise them for 4 months with a standard Cooperian workout of 80% maximal 3 times a week. You get a rapid change in the amount of vasculature that's going into the dentate gyrus, and the BDNF levels have risen precipitously as well as the executive function. So it's a brain-specific effect. And all of a sudden, when I'm writing the book Brain Rules, because I don't think we know squat about how the brain works, if I were to re-engineer the whole thing, all of learning environments, in order to more effectively capture the little that we do know, if you were doing an elementary school, say, you might try something like this. And so my last slide for this brain rule is here. Here's a typical day. Here is our exercise. Is this a school day of the future? Whereby you have a short-term aerobic exercise, and you're going to have content throughout the day, but you're going to have short-term exercise here, and then let's go for 5 days. Yep, so let's do it all the time. Maybe you want to do a little bit of toning so that you're going to look nice. Doesn't really matter as long as you're getting your butt off the desk and start working. Maybe the school of the future will have a uniform. And you know what the uniform will be? It will be gym clothes. And when you go to school, all you'll be doing is a 6-hour workout punctuated by learning. Next brain rule, stress. How much time do I have? Yeah, I probably have time to do stress. Then I'll take questions for sure, but I want to make sure we get through some of this. Okay, how many of you listen to Prairie Home Companion on a regular basis? You listen to Garrison Keillor? I love Garrison Keillor, great storyteller. How many of you are familiar with The Joke Show of Garrison Keillor? Familiar with this? A couple of you? He just gathers all around the country his favorite jokes, and then he airs them. And I have his top 2 favorite jokes, apparently, of all time. This one, the first one involves Garrison Keillor's love affair with being a Lutheran pastor, and it is directly related to this brain rule. Brain rule number 8. Stressed brains don't learn the same way as non-stressed brains. All right, here is the story. There is this Lutheran pastor who decides that he is not going to preach on a Sunday, but he's also not going to tell his congregation because the congregation doesn't like the fact that this pastor likes to go hunting. And in fact, he likes to go bear hunting, and he's got a good 30-06, and he wants to go out into the hills and shoot bears. And his congregation doesn't like it, so he just takes off, and he goes off into the hills with his 30-06, and he's going to go take down a bear. And he's climbing up to the hill, and he sees a bear out of the corner of his eye, but the bear's got a cub, and it's a female, so the bears come charging down at him, and the Lutheran pastor loses it, and he throws his gun into the air and is running down the hill, and he trips, breaks his ankle, and the bear comes hovering over him as the pastor is quivering, and the pastor prays. And the pastor says, "Oh God, I repent for not having preached on Sunday and instead killing your great creation, but please do something. Turn this bear into a Christian. In fact, make him a Lutheran." And the bear all of a sudden gets this soft, gentle look on his face. And the pastor gets this relieved look on his face. And the bear looks down at him, clasps his paws towards heaven, and says, "Oh God, I do thank you for the food I am about to receive." So, at the moment when the pastor is realizing what is about to happen to him, if you try to give him a calculus test, how well do you think he's going to do? And the answer is, he's not going to do very well at all because of the brain rule. Stressed brains don't learn the same way as non-stressed brains. Now, the first thing I have to tell you about this rule is that until about 10 to 15 years ago, believe it or not, we did not have a good idea about what stress actually was. And I'm going to try to make the case that a very particular type of stress can hurt a very particular type of learning. But we didn't know what stress was for the longest time. And certainly in my world, which is the world of the molecular biologist, trying to have that make sense to a piece of nucleotide real estate is difficult to do. There were three reasons for that ambiguity. Number one is that not all stress is actually bad for learning. Okay? Some stress is actually pretty good for learning, as long as it's not too much. Number two, if you are your self-report, if I were to ask you what stressed you out, no two people here would probably give me the exact same answer. Some of you love jumping out of airplanes for recreation. Others of you would consider that to be your worst nightmare. So what is going to be a self-report is going to be fairly ambiguous. What is stressful to one person is not necessarily stressful to somebody else. How are you going to make a measurement off of that in the laboratory? Number three, worst of all, if you are experiencing intense pleasure, or you are experiencing intense stress, and you give me a physiological panel, but you blind it, randomize it maybe a little bit, give me a bunch of them, so that see if I could pick out which of you were experiencing intense pleasure and which of you were experiencing intense stress, I can't tell the difference because the body reacts nearly identically to both. So, what are you going to do in a laboratory if you've got a stress situation where not everybody's experienced the same stress? Some stress is good for learning, and we haven't the slightest idea what it is physiologically. How are you going to get at it? The answer came from Jean-Sok Kim and David Diamond working with an old guy named Marty Seligman. Has anybody ever heard of Marty Seligman before? Marty Seligman, he coined the term learned helplessness, for those of you who are into it. And the research scared him so much that he actually went into learned optimist. And now that's actually what he studies for a living, is how can you learn optimism. Learned helplessness, though, he made his career on the back of a really horrible set of experiments that were very essential to understanding. He would give dogs electric shocks and not allow them to be removed from the electric shocks, and then and harness them so that the dogs couldn't go anywhere. And then he did an extraordinary thing, and he would shock them for a long, long time. Then he would remove the harness and allow them to get out if they wanted to and still have them hooked up to the electrodes. And those who had experienced it for a long time had gotten the idea that there was no way out. And so even when you remove the harness and allow the dog to come out and resume the shocks, do you know what the dogs do? Nothing. They just sit there and they take it, because they had gotten the idea that there is no way out. So if you have stressful ambiguity, but what you began to see, and Jean-Sok Kim's great contribution was to show that the type of stress that really does hurt learning, I've drawn here a voltmeter, forgive me. Think of it as the control-o-meter. The more out of control you feel over a given stressor that is coming at you, the more likely you are to begin to experience the type of stress that can hurt you intellectually. That's the idea. So, out of control is in two dimensions. So here we go. We're going to go from in control, but as the aversive stimulus, you become out of control of it. Out of control in two dimensions. Number one, you cannot control the frequency of the shocks that you are getting. And number two, you cannot control the severity of the shocks once they arrive. So there they are. Number one, the aversive stimulus is not avoidable. You are trapped. Number two, you cannot connect any of your actions with even a slight ability to modulate the presence or severity of the aversive stimuli. Can you see where I'm going with this? The more out of control you feel over those things which piss you off, or those things that truly hurt you, the more likely you are to begin to experience the type of stress that hurts learning. And we can unpack that. You can begin to experience the type of stress that actually can hurt your ability to have internal relationships in almost every way you can measure it, you guys, and there's a bunch of stuff on this slide. There's executive function and a sub of problem solving. Here's your memory panel, spatial reasoning, fluid intelligence, which is the ability to improvise off of data. Once you've gotten it, can you apply it to different situations in a creative way, reaction times, and then emotional regulation, which is called vagal tone. In almost every way that you can look at it, when you begin to experience the type of stress that will eventually throw you into a depression, you will begin to experience things that look like this. So your competence begins to become very low. Stress damages cognition in virtually every way cognition can be measured. We even know why. The definitions were tight enough that it began to make sense to the world of the molecules in which I reside. And this is animated. You'll see it. There's a side view of the brain. Excess catecholamine stress hormones attack and destroy cells involved in human learning. I'm about to tell you that the type of stress that I am describing to you, if you keep at it, since you can't control what's coming at you and you can't control the depth once it arrives, you will begin to damage, damage your brain. Let's take a look at it. And damage it in the hippocampus, the very area you don't want damaged. Okay? It's involved in learning. Three things begin to happen. First of all, you have a dendritic remodeling, which results in cell atrophy, so you are destroying the number of connections in the hippocampus. Functional loss, there's something called LTP, which is directly related to long-term memory formation. Long-term potentiation is what it's called. You begin to inhibit it. And then finally, you kill cells in the brain when you have that stress. In fact, we don't know the mechanism of it is, but we know when the stress hormones, the catecholamines, sweep into the hippocampus, the hippocampal cells can actually divide. They'll divide once, and then the daughter cells sense that something is wrong, and they die. The more stress you feel, the less productive your brain becomes in an area where your brain needs to be productive. That's a brain rule. And that's what happens. Okay. Is there anything we can do? Geez, I still got like a couple of slides to go here. There is some good news here. And maybe we should start to get into the good news. But the good news, once again, upends things. I told you that you would have to tear down a few things and start over if you really started to take this stuff seriously. Because I can't be prescriptive. I have no idea how this stuff could apply. But if you'll stay with me, let's talk a little bit about a potential solution. And to do that, I have to introduce you to some people who were not even born when she died. I hear Dear Abby is dead. Is that right? Are you familiar with Dear Abby? Somebody familiar with Dear Abby? And she had a twin sister whose name was? Ann Landers, yeah, who also died. This is apparently one of Dear Abby's favorite letters of all time. And it begins to hit at a solution, though I think it's an interesting insight into Dear Abby that this might be a letter that she would actually publish in a book. Dear Abby, it relates to stress. The letter from the apartment dwellers who can't sleep because of the noisy mattress acrobatics of the couple upstairs calls to mind my husband's famous faux pas. We had a problem with the Smiths, whose bedroom was directly over ours. The first time my husband ran into Mr. Smith, my husband told him with a knowing wink that their noisy nocturnal lovemaking had been interfering with our sleep. My husband received an icy stare. We later learned that Mr. Smith worked nights. Signed, Red-Faced in Chicago. The reason why I want to talk about that is because I want to talk about marriage, and particularly in the home environment, and particularly a very famous colleague whose name is John Gottman. Is anybody familiar with John Gottman's work? Maybe some of you are. For those who aren't, he's emeritus out of the Department of Psychology at the University of Washington, and I have had the great privilege of at least rubbing shoulders occasionally with John in terms of some research projects. John is famous for a couple things. He actually has two giant strands of research. One is on marriage, the other is on parenting. And he actually ended up combining them into a study that he called the Bringing Baby Home Project. But it brings to mind a very interesting idea, a potential way at getting at stress. Here's something if you have children. How many of you have kids in here? Okay, and I'll raise my hand, I do too. One of the single greatest predictors of academic success that exists is the emotional stability of the home. Do you know that? One of the single greatest predictors, it's not the only, and it's not even the greatest, but one of the greatest single predictors of academic success that exists is the emotional stability of the home. And Gottman decided he wanted to go after it because he was working both with parents and with marriage. If you have a baby in the United States, the amount of marital conflict by the time the kid is 6 months of age goes up precipitously. By the time you are, the kid is a year old, the amount of depression on the part of the female has gone up by about 62.5%, whereas the controls are down about 23%. And he started asking, you know, in the United States, if you have a baby, it's tough on a marriage. Is it tough on an employee? Is it tough in the odd work-life balance that Google so marvelously smears around here? Marvelously or not. Is there something that can be done? Well, John's great work starts with marriage, so let's do his marriage stuff, and then we'll get to the kids. He created something that is called the Love Lab. It's not what you're thinking. The Love Lab is a test that will actually measures the assessment of how marriages are working. The couple will actually go into a lab together, and they'll rig them up with a GSR and an ERP, often an EKG, peeing into a cup maybe every 3 hours to get the catecholamines. And I mean, there's 2 video cameras on, and this couple is just being asked to do things like, please remodel your house together and let us hear it. Listen to those discussions. Here, why don't you raise your kids together and let us get in? Pretty soon, you get a real good idea of how the marriage is going. But he's a behaviorist, one of the best of our time. And he creates these behavioral algorithms that actually gives the couple a score at the end of the test. Scores how good their marriage is. Yes, he rates the marriage. And he rates the marriage in such fashion, and the number is so robust that he can actually predict what's going to happen to the marriage within a couple of weeks or a couple of months or a couple of years after the incept of the test. He can tell you whether you're going to get a divorce or not. He is 96.4% accurate. By that I mean you take 100 couples, he can accurately predict what's going to happen to 96.4 of them. So, you know, that's a very nice thing to have, but it's a little bit like cloning the gene for Alzheimer's. You can tell somebody you've got a disease, there's nothing you can do about it. You know, and in fact, there are some where you can almost put your arm around the couple and say, why don't you guys go get your lawyers now? This thing is so over. Stress. Learned helplessness stress, I might add. If you no longer can control the aversive stimulus coming at your spouse or from your spouse to you, you are entering into the out-of-control needle. So here's the idea. He said, okay, if it really is like cloning the gene for Alzheimer's and there's nothing I can do about it, you know, I've coded these behaviors. They are algorithms. Could I dig in there? Could I find a statistical correlation? Could I find an independent variable that always predicted the number? A true independent variable such that if a behavior, in these are behaviors, if the behavior was always present, the marriage made it, and if the behavior was always absent, the marriage failed. Does that make sense? He found one, which is why he's world famous. Would you like to know what it is? I'll tell you, it falls on gender lines. These are heterosexual relationships that have been actually married by ceremony. It's older data. Here is this strong sense. The independent variable is, if the woman feels like she is being heard by the man in such fashion that he begins to accept her good influence on his behavior, guys, this does not look good. The marriage makes it. And if that behavior, and the behavior is really simple. He's crying. Why is he crying? Because she's crying. John thinks he's actually measuring a very sophisticated form of empathy, which can be a very difficult thing over a long period of time, sustaining over a long period of time for two people. But if you can see that the marriage statistically makes it, and if it's not there, the marriage begins to fail. And he said, if that's a true independent variable, I should be able to test it. Isn't that a great idea? Rather than just say, this is what you should do, he then said, why don't we just test it? What if your marriage is in trouble in the United States, on average you're going to go to marriage counseling for about 9 months, and then after the 9 months, a whole bunch of you are going to file for divorce, and the divorce rate is still around 50%. So John considers that a failure. I consider that a failure too. That's a business, that's a failure. So the question is, what if we just drill down on this one independent variable and forget the other 8 months? Maybe we can just do 4 on successive weekends. Could I begin to change that number if we brought them back into the Love Lab? What would begin to happen to their divorce rates? That's a question that was asked about 10 years ago and published in a peer-reviewed journal, and it's one of the reasons why he's so darn famous. Here it is. All right, here's the experiment, per se. There's the couple. We're going to do 640 couples, so statistically this is very robust. Puts them all through the Love Lab. 27% of them are going to get a divorce. And now we're going to deploy the intervention. He knows that from the Love Lab score. Here comes the intervention. Boom, right there. And now we're going to test them again. So at the 3-month mark, how's the couple doing? Well, the couple is doing on a 3-month follow-up. They dropped it to 6.7% divorce. And by the end of the 9-month, where the controls are at 50% divorce rate, nobody divorced. In other words, he nailed it. That is an independent variable that when always present predicts a number and when always absent predicts its failure. So, if that's the case, the question you can ask was this. If you're interested in kids and you're interested in brains and development, remember I told you that when you have a baby, the amount of marital conflict by the time that kid is 6 months of age is just skyrocketing. What if you taught these very stabilizing behaviors to a couple while they were pregnant? Before the collapse would come. What would you get? would you begin to stabilize the home? Well, I'm glad you asked. The project is called the Bringing Baby Home Project. Here's the experimental design. Some of this has been published in a peer review, and the other is now awaiting final, but I can give you certainly the peer review, and I'll tell you what the final is. Here we go. Pregnancy, birth, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and 24 months of age. Marital intervention therapy, here. Doesn't really matter as long as it's around the pregnancy with a nice, good 6-month follow-up is nice to have. Alrighty, now, here's what you do, though. You test, at the end of 6 months, you test the couple's marital status, and at the same time, you test the infant's developing nervous system. And then at 12 months, you test the couple's marital score, test the developing infant's nervous system. At 18 months, you test the couple's marital score and the infant's nervous system. You can see where this is going on till school age. What are you going to do if you stabilize the home? If one of the greatest predictors of academic success that exists is the stability of the home, what hypothesis would you want to test? Well, it's fairly straightforward. Here are the results of the Bringing Baby Home. This is the stuff that has been published for the marriage stuff, and then the baby stuff is still coming online. So you have non-intervened and intervened. Baby's age is at 3 months. What happened to the dads? Hostility index, that's what happens. And if they're intervened, that's what you get. Okay, relative instability if you don't intervene. Relative stability if you do. Most important part for those of us who are interested in psychiatric disorders is this guy, because the F33.1 depressions are at 62.5% in the controls and drop it back down to what we think is its genetic norm by the time the baby is at 12 months of age. So he truly got it. These marriages are stable. Something is really happening here, and that's just actually a confirmation of all his other marriage work. What you really want is what's happening to the kids. And this is the stuff that is still finishing review, but I can show you some of the data parts. This is response to external stimuli on the part of an infant. If the infant is stressed and is not going to mobilize their IQ, they're going to be disorganized. The ability to shift an attentional state. If the baby is stressed, they are not going to be able to organize their responses, and a lot of not good things are going to happen. And what do you see here? The controls versus the experimentals. My goodness gracious sakes. They are disorganized in the controls that didn't get the intervention. They are hyper-organized in the sense that do the ability to shift attentional states. The babies in the controls are disorganized, and the babies that are in the intervened groups are well organized. And you see this almost everywhere. There's probably 8 different data points to show, and I'm just showing the behavioral as opposed to the physiology. But the one I think that is most interesting is the overall amount of crying. Attuned to paternal interactions, that's actually a measure of stranger response, also very sad for males in the audience. There you are. But it's less in the controls, more in the experimentals. But we now think that a great deal, maybe as much as half of baby crying, is due to the stress that they're perceiving at home. These are often pre-verbal infants now, but as you may know, infants are sponges for behavioral work, and there's a lot of really cool things babies can do. So the results of this appear to be, once that gets published, then I can give you the citation for it too. You won't find it yet, but it's coming. The bottom line is this. When adults begin to deploy these interventions, they begin to feel in control of the aversive stimuli which had previously plagued their interpersonal relationships. These feelings of control are so powerful that they actually change the developing nervous systems of the children being raised in the home. And all of a sudden, I have an idea for you, or for any company that is large and has familial instincts such fashion that you actually have laundry drop-offs in doctors' offices. What if you did this? This was actually, talked to Boeing a little bit about this, so this was more for them than you, but it's an idea with no basis in reality, for sure, and I fully understand that. But who cares? What would a school look like if a business started a school for their employees' children? So, you have a typical school that looks like this. First grade begins, well, they're 6 years old, and then moves forward. That's our typical model. The student is a child, the starting age is 6 years, the curriculum is first grade based, the facilities are a typical school. In a new model, what if you did something like this? You start first grade at birth. But the student starting age curriculum facilities are really weird. The student is parents, caregivers who are the employees of the company. The starting age, well, you're adults, reproductively competent, so there you go. Curriculum is how to create a stable emotional landscape at home, and the facilities is an on-site pre-K elementary school. Would your divorce rates drop? They most certainly would. Would absenteeism drop? Maybe. Healthcare costs drop? Absolutely. A whole generation of kids mobilizing their IQ? Perhaps. Would such a school actually improve productivity? We know squat about how the brain works. But the little we do know suggests that the systems we have designed are backwards. And if you could tear it down and start over and use your imaginations, perhaps it would be something like this. I'm fully aware that your marriages or your primary relationships are none of my business. It's none of anybody else's business either. Problem is, you decide to have kids, and it becomes the society's business. I don't have time to do brain rule number 3. Maybe we can come back and do it another time. I was going to talk about multitasking. Instead, I would like to finish off and then take some questions here by reading to you what I think is the most important brain rule of all, and it's nothing I can measure. When I was little, my mother, who was a 4th grade teacher, probably the single best information transfer specialist I ever saw, when her son John, that would be me, was little, she saw that I had a strong interest in dinosaurs. And you know what she did to the whole frickin' house? She filled the whole house with dinosaurs. She filled it with dinosaur posters. She filled it with these dinosaur manipulatives. We would cook dinosaur food. My mother is the one who taught me how to do this, because she thought that the sound that was coming out was more like the empty nasal chamber that is in a lot of dinosaurs, and that might be the sound of a dinosaur. I mean, she went nuts. And we would have dinosaurs all throughout the house until my interests changed. And then that amazing woman did this. She's dead now. She brought down all the dinosaur stuff, and she waited. She said sometimes she felt like a lynx until the new interest arose. It would be, well, I was born in 1956, so Sputnik was not quite my issue, but certainly the Gemini and Apollo programs were. Space! And you know what the whole house would be filled with? What do you think it would be filled with? Space! And we've got ships, and we've got Fireball XL5. I remember she actually bought me the model, and here's Saturn, and here's Neptune, and here's a whole bunch of things. The whole thing, on and on and on she did for me, because she began to teach me something that was so precious that I've never been able to get it out of my skull, and that is the unbelievable power of unrestricted curiosity. And that the only thing that mattered to her was my interests, and that was necessary and sufficient for her to flood her whole house, which could have been nice and pristine. Instead, she turned it into a university. Here's the way I end the book, because I have tried to do that. I have unlearned that lesson, to my shame, because I have mortgage payments, and I've had the real world. But the real world, what I consider to be the real world, was brought back to me in spades in the very last sentences of the book. I'd like to read it to you, and then I'll take some questions. My 2-year-old son, Noah, he's now 8. My 2-year-old son, Noah, and I were walking down the street on our way to preschool when he suddenly noticed a shiny pebble embedded in the concrete. Stopping mid-stride, the little guy considered it for a second, found it thoroughly delightful, and let out a laugh. He spied a small plant an inch farther, a weed valiantly struggling through a crack in the asphalt. He touched it gently and then laughed again. Noah noticed beyond it a platoon of ants marching in single file, which he bent down to examine closely. They were carrying a dead bug, and Noah clapped his hands in wonder. There were dust particles, a rusted screw, a shiny spot of oil. 15 minutes had passed, and we had only gone 20 feet. I tried to get him to move along, having the audacity to act like an adult with a schedule. He was having none of it. And I stopped, remembering my mother, watching my now little teacher, wondering how long it had been since I had taken 15 minutes to walk 20 feet. The greatest brain rule of all is something I cannot prove or characterize, but I believe in it with all my heart. As my son was trying to tell me, it was the importance of curiosity. For his sake, and for ours, I wish classrooms and businesses were designed with the brain in mind. If we started over, curiosity would be the most vital part of both demolition crew and reconstruction crew. As I hope to have related here, I am very much in favor of both. I will never forget the moment this little professor taught his daddy about what it meant to be a student. I was thankful and a little embarrassed. After 47 years, I was finally learning how to walk down the street. Thank you very much. Okay, I have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. So fire away. Well, use the microphones.
What was the marriage intervention?
What was the marriage intervention? Marriage intervention was over a 4-week period. But what it was is it was teaching, there were 2 parts to it. One of them, it was teaching men how to listen to their wives and quit judging them. That was the big deal. Because men will often aim a very interesting thing at women and say, you're too emotional and you're too wordy and I can't understand all this stuff. It's cultural prejudice, in my view, but it's a real one. And so what happens is that what you do is you just lift that schema out, you kind of pluck it out of your head and think of a new way to interact to those feelings. And in fact, it can be taught. It is a very sophisticated organ that's fully adaptive. The second one, though, is on the part of the females. And so there was something, the females had to be taught to be able to communicate their psychological interiors in such fashion that the man could actually understand it. It takes a whole month, you guys. Okay, I can take maybe 2 more questions. So, yeah.
How much of this is cultural? The man listening to the woman? And there are certain cultures where men don't listen to women.
Yeah.
Maybe it's universal, but
Oh, that's a great question. I think that it's probably primarily cultural, with maybe one small, I'm not going to use the word genetic, but there's a brain rule that men and women's brains are wired differently. And in one particular case, you can actually show it. And let me give that to you. Are you familiar with theory of mind? You ever heard of that before? Big T, little o, big M? Go Google it, please. What's so nice to be able to say that here. Get it. Theory of mind is a big deal. It's a big deal for businesses. Theory of mind is the ability to look inside somebody else's head and understand the rewards and punishment systems inside that head. We have sometimes called it intuition, but you can measure it formally. It's measured on the back of what are called mirror neurons. So use the keyword mirror neurons, theory of mind, and you'll get most of that research literature. Theory of mind is, in my opinion, a potentially very powerful management tool. And you can measure it. Some people are really good at it, and some people aren't. Women, on average, are twice as good at it as men. Yeah.
Professor, do you believe in magic?
I do every time I gaze at my children.
No, I'm just kidding. What I mean is the paranormal studies that are published, do you believe in that?
Well, hopefully I'm a nice guy, but I'm a really grumpy scientist. And I am, in the end, a reductionist. So if you can show me, I'm still waiting for the $1 million prize to be triggered, where it can actually be demonstrated under controlled conditions, and I've yet to see it. As a scientist, I have to be grumpy about everything and be able to be willing to believe anything. Maybe I can give the general idea of the question is this. If you care what you believe, you should never be in the investigative fields, ever. You can't care what you believe. You just have to care what's out there. And when you do that, your bandwidth is as wide as that sounds. And the rigor, usually it's on the back of something quantitative, but it can be just the rigor of a good controlled experiment, has to be as narrow as the biggest bigots you've ever seen. Both are resident in a scientist's brain at the same time. Yeah. The question is, can I give you just the headlines on multitasking? We're good to go for the... This is it. Okay, here it is. Okay. I have to unpack this. This is 15 minutes, but I'll give it to you in one sentence. You can't do it. Thank you very much.